Hey, welcome to Wild Earth, and today I'm reviewing the Tamron 55mm 500mm mirror lens. As you can see, it's a very small lens for being a 500mm lens. Now, I've used this lens for birding over the past few months, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it and whether you should get it. So let's talk about the general features of this lens. It's an all-manual 500mm lens with a fixed f8 aperture. It's very well built, and the focus ring turns very nicely. And this is a lens from the film era days, so this lens was once used by wildlife photographers who shot film. And you can actually see some of these shots if you look at old nature books. You can see the bokeh that this lens produces. As I mentioned, this lens is completely manual focus, so you will not be able to autofocus this lens, and therefore you are kind of restricted with which subjects you take pictures of. Now, the manual focus ring is pretty good. It has a fairly long focus throw, so it's actually fairly easy to focus using a mirrorless camera. It's a little harder to focus using a DSLR, so this lens can be adapted to any type of DSLR or mirrorless lens if you get the right kind of adapter. And the adapters are pretty cheap, but I still prefer using this lens on a mirrorless camera. I've actually tried to use it on a DSLR, and it's very hard to focus and use. Additionally, this lens does not have vibration reduction. And so because of that, it's going to be much easier to use on a mirrorless camera where the mirrorless camera has IBIS. Most DSLRs except Pentax cameras do not have IBIS, so there's no way to stabilize this lens unless, of course, you use it on a mirrorless camera or a Pentax camera. Now, another feature of this lens is that it has a fixed f8 aperture. What that means is inside the lens, and if you look in through this lens, it has no aperture mechanism. So that means you can't adjust the aperture of this lens. It's always fixed at f8. So in order to adjust the exposure of this lens, you're going to have to either use shutter speed or the ISO. Now, that's not really a problem, but if you want to let in more light or change the depth of field, you will not be able to do so by modifying an aperture, because there is no aperture. Now let's talk a little bit more about the VR mechanism. So this lens being all manual and all mechanical, it has no electronic contacts, and therefore it has no VR capability. It has no optical stabilization built into the lens. So that means that if you're using a DSLR camera, the viewfinder will be very shaky. And even if you use this lens on a mirrorless camera, the viewfinder will be a little more shaky than a lens which has optical stabilization built into the lens. So what that means is you're going to have a little more trouble stabilizing your shots compared to a more modern super zoom or prime lens of this focal length. Optical quality of this lens. How does this lens compare to more modern lenses? Well, the downside, and I'll give you the downside first, is that this lens, let me open it up for you, has a mirror lens construction, which means that instead of like a normal lens, light passing through the entire body of the lens, it bounces off a bunch of mirrors inside the lens before actually getting into your camera. That's what allows this lens to be very compact. Unfortunately, that also means that the lens has lower contrast and lower sharpness. And so this lens will never be as sharp as a standard lens, even a budget super zoom like a Tamron 150-600 G2 or a Nikon 7300mm lens. Any of those budget 7300mm lenses are going to be sharper than this lens. However, because this lens does have a 500mm focal length, you can somewhat make up for that by getting closer to your subject. So that's one thing. Another thing is chromatic aberrations. That's a good thing about this lens. Because of the mirror design again, this lens does not have any chromatic aberrations. I've shot thousands of shots on it, and I haven't noticed any chromatic aberrations when using it. So that's another cool thing about it. Now, I did mention that this lens wasn't as sharp as other lenses like a... Okay. Still, one more time. Now, I did mention that this lens isn't as sharp as most modern lenses that aren't of a mirror design. Now, that doesn't mean it's not sharp. I've actually tested this lens against at least one other mirror lens, and I've seen many shots with mirror lenses. And what I've noticed is that this lens is one of the sharpest mirror lenses in existence. So if you're going for a mirror lens, this is probably one of the best choices of a mirror lens, assuming you can find a good copy on eBay. Now, another important thing you have to keep in mind about this kind of lens is that the bokeh is just very strange. And a lot of people don't like it. Now, why don't they like it? Well, unlike a normal lens, which produces these sort of out of focus circles or spheres, this lens produces donuts. Now you'll see this in many of these samples, such as this image that I'm showing you right now. If you see in the inside of this lens, you'll see that there's this big plastic thing in the middle. Now what that means is that the bokeh is going to have a kind of donut shape, just like the design of this lens. So is that going to affect your photos? Well, in most cases, yes. If your background is very far away, then you might actually get away with not showing these donut bokeh circles. But in other cases, you're going to see them. So in most shots, you're going to see at least some level of donuts. If there are only a few specular highlights in your shot, then actually it might produce a very interesting and artistic effect, and I've actually liked this effect in many of my shots. But in other cases, if the background is a little busy, then the out of focus background produced by this lens is going to actually be kind of horrible. And in cases where a normal lens would work, this lens might not always work. So you might actually ruin a lot of your shots using it. But in other cases, the creative effect can be quite cool. So I think the donut bokeh is more a matter of experimentation and finding a situation in where it works, instead of just trying to use it like a normal lens. Can you use this lens for birding? That's a good question. Well, I'm a wildlife photographer and I mostly just take pictures of birds. So I'm really speaking about this lens in terms of its use for birds. And when it comes to birds, I think this lens can work very well in certain cases. For example, if the bird is very still and you have time to focus this lens, then you can use it for birds. And if you keep practicing with it, you'll get faster. So I think for most perch birds, this lens works pretty well. Now, there are cases where it doesn't work for bird photography, and that is when the bird is moving. Now, birds move a lot. And so in those cases, this lens won't do a very good job. The manual focus feature, or the manual focus design of this lens, means that you'll have to manual focus on a moving object, and that's almost impossible. Now, there are some cases where it's actually interesting for birds, and that is because this lens has a very short minimum focus distance, which means you can get a lot closer to your subject compared to using a normal lens. So in some cases, this lens will actually be better for birds, especially very tame birds, which you can get very close to compared to a regular lens. So it can be used for birds. Sometimes it produces cool effects, and its short minimum focus distance can actually help you with birds. But in other cases where the bird is moving or where the background is not very nice, then this lens might not be very good for that case. What are the alternatives to this lens? Well, I don't think there are any mirror lens alternatives to this lens. This lens is probably one of the best mirror lenses, so if you want a mirror lens, you can definitely get this lens. But there are alternatives in the normal lens world, like a 7300 super zoom. Those types of lenses don't zoom in as far as 500 millimeters. They don't have as long a focal length, but they're of similar size. And those lenses are sharper and they don't produce strange bokeh. Now, the problem with those lenses is they don't have a 500 millimeter focal length. So you're not going to get as close with a 7300 zoom as you will with this 500 millimeter lens. Now, although those 7300 zoom lenses are sharper than this mirror lens, because this has a little bit more focal length, you'll still probably get similar results, at least in terms of detail on your subject, with this lens as opposed to a 7300 zoom. And 7300 zooms are probably a bit more expensive than this lens too. Another set of alternatives for this lens are the longer super zooms, like the recently released Nikon 180-600mm lens, or the Sony 200-600, or the older DSLR variants like the Tamron 150-600 G2 lens. Now, those lenses, of course, will produce much better results than this little old mirror lens, but the downside of those lenses are they're much heavier. Those lenses weigh typically around 2 kilograms, whereas this is probably around a few hundred grams, and they're also a lot bigger. So you're going to be carrying around a giant honking piece of glass compared to this mirror lens. And the other disadvantage of those lenses, of course, is that they're much more expensive. They typically cost around $2,000, whereas this lens goes for about $200 on eBay. So although those lenses are much better for bird photography, you're going to have to spend a lot more to get that additional level of quality. Okay, so who is this lens made for? Well, this lens is not made for someone who wants to get top quality, 5-star, golden light bird shots, and if you want to become like the best bird photographer. This lens will be simply too limiting in that case. But on the other hand, if you want to do some creative photography with some unusual bokeh, this lens could be quite interesting. And even though I own much more expensive lenses, I like the creative effects of this lens. So I think this lens is suitable for two kinds of people. You want to produce unusual and creative portraits of birds using the strange bokeh or the close minimum focus distance that this lens provides. Another kind of person that this lens could be good for is the kind of person that wants to experiment with the 500mm focal length without having to spend a lot of money on a huge piece of glass. And in that case, this lens could be a very good way to experiment with bird photography without necessarily spending a lot of money, especially if you already own a mirrorless camera, because then you can just buy an adapter, stick this cheap lens on it, and do a lot of good bird photography. And you can still get 5-star shots with this lens, but just not as often, and you'll need a lot more practice compared to a lens with autofocus. Overall, personally, I really like this lens. I think it produces some interesting results at times. It allows you to take a lens to places where you don't want to bring a bigger lens, and it's just a fun little lens to experiment with because it has a few cool effects. This lens is not a general lens that will be useful for all cases. It has very limited applications. It has the creative effect, but it also has the manual focus limitation, the fixed f8 aperture, which produces pretty noisy shots compared to faster lenses. And in general, it's just a harder lens to use than a typical modern lens. So while I like this lens, it is a specialty lens, and I would recommend it for someone who already knows what they're getting into or just wants to experiment a little with the 500mm focal length. So I hope you enjoyed the review of this lens. I certainly enjoy using it. If you like this review, don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and give me some comments. Buy my products, sponsor me, give me a lot of money, all kinds of other stuff. I don't know what else to say, but yeah, that's about it. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you again next time.